Well, welcome. I'm Phil Mullan. Welcome to the final session of the economy strand. A few of you, I think, have been here all day. Me and Catherine have been here most of the day in this room. It'd be nice tomorrow to have a change. This session was originally inspired by some ambiguous comments made before the general election by Keir Starmer about, he said, resetting Britain's relationship with Brussels, and the thought that this might mean the government seeking to water down Britain's departure from the European Union. Obviously, there's been more discussion about resetting since. But not much has happened concretely. Early days, they say, and the Cabinet seems to have had a few distractions in its first 100 days of events and self-inflicted mishaps. But the question of UK-EU relations, I think, certainly remains relevant, given not least the enduring presumption from some people that Britain's economic problems have been at the least exacerbated by Brexit, and with the persisting suggestion that some realignment with the EU could help to meet the government's stated #1 priority of growth. So to discuss the consequence of Britain's changing economic relationship, past, present and future with Europe, our panel this afternoon, in order of speaking, is first Catherine McBride, who some of you may have seen in an earlier session. She's an economist, a fellow for the Centre for Brexit Policy, and who's written with great rigour and detail on the impact Brexit has had on Britain's trade. And she's also a member of the Department of Business and Trade's Independent Trade and Agriculture Commission. After Catherine, we have here Dr. Thomas Sampson. He's an associate professor of economics at the London School of Economics, and he's an associate in the trade programme there at the Centre for Economic Performance, where he too has analysed the implications of Brexit for the UK economy. I think from what I've read of there is from a slightly different perspective to Catherine. Third, we have Ali Miraj. He's a media broadcaster, infrastructure financier, an experienced house music DJ. I always have to say that. But he'd also founded the annual Contrarian Prize, which recognises, quote, the independence, courage and sacrifice of British public figures whose ideas challenge the status quo. So very much a friend of the battle of ideas over the years with that sentiment. And then finally, we have Gawain Towler at the end of the table here. He's an experienced head of press and communications, formerly with the UK Independence Party, then with the Brexit Party, and until recently at Reform UK. Though I don't think there's been a fallout there, he's still very much a supporter of the Reform Party. He also runs his own PR firm, CWC Strategy, whose initials, I think, stand for Crisis What Crisis. Sorry. So, can we welcome our platform?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I really don't think that the Labour Party or any government in the UK is ever going to rejoin the EU, especially now that the EU is making itself so unattractive. Its own economy is in real trouble, and I think you'd be kind of crazy to join it. We certainly won't be rejoining an economic nirvana. Sorry if I could bring that closer. Since Brexit, we've done a lot of things that get virtually no press. We've adjusted a lot of our laws that get, unfortunately, virtually no attention. Everyone is worried about the cost of Brexit, but no one's looking at the advantages. A good example is right now the EU introduced a carbon border tax last year. We haven't introduced one. We do propose to do one in 2027, but we're going to do it on slightly different commodities. And that is because in the UK's economy, we are more interested in the carbon emissions of glass and ceramics, where the EU is not interested in those at all. So they did not include glass and ceramics in their carbon border tax. So what we've been able to do, even if you don't like Brexit, is we've been able to mimic the EU's laws, but tweak them so that they suit the UK economy. And that is a phenomenal advantage to any government, and one that most governments in the world outside the EU actually always enjoy, but it's one that we haven't been able to do for almost 50 years. And that comes in with everything. It was only in January this year that UK courts were finally the ultimate arbiters of UK laws. Up until that point, our judges had to take into account any EU laws. Also, Brexit has restored sovereignty to our parliament, so we get to debate things. So the UK introduced an online safety bill. The EU has a Digital Services Act. Our online safety bill bounced between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. There are a lot of amendments put to it. There's a lot of arguments, and Baroness Fox can probably give you the full blow-by-blow of what happened. But in the end, we got the rules we wanted. Had we still been a member of the EU, we would have had to impose their Digital Services Act as it was written in Brussels. We would have had nothing to do with that. And this has happened with financiers as well. You know, we were going to take back control of our laws, our finance, our money and our borders. Well, certainly in our money, we no longer pay 80% of our customs duty to Brussels, which we used to have to do. And we imported more goods from outside the EU than any other EU country. We no longer have to send a proportion of our VAT to the EU, nor do we have to send them an amount of money based on our national income. Now, also with VAT, the EU determined what the rate was, or the minimum rate. They also determined what goods we could put VAT on, what goods we could put a reduced VAT on, and what goods could be VAT-free. Since we left, the Conservative government dropped VAT on things that they want people to do, like solar panels, and now VAT-free, and electric heat pumps are VAT-free. So that's something that we could not do when we're members of the EU, which sounds really stupid when you think we've got a government that wants to encourage people to go into green technology. And yet, under the EU, we would have had to have added VAT to the cost of doing that. And it's already an expensive thing. The UK government also has dropped the nuisance tariffs. The EU loved tariffs, and they had tariffs on virtually everything, many of which were below 2%. Now, this isn't a big cost to the import, but it does mean that you have to fill in a lot of paperwork and you have to send some money to someone. We got rid of all of those, which was a fantastic boom to a lot of importers, because with modern manufacturing, there's a huge supply chain where parts are coming from all over the world and semi-finished goods are coming from all over the world, and they're getting put together. So to have a whole lot of below 2% tariffs was just a nuisance. And the government also got rid of 162 tariffs on goods that we don't make. Weirdly, we had to have import tariffs on things like orange juice and tropical fruit juices and nuts and ambient tofu, dried onions, all sorts of things that the UK doesn't actually make. But we still had to put tariffs on to protect someone in one of the 27 other EU nations. So the last Conservative government got rid of those, and that's a temporary suspension. It will expire in June 2026, but I really doubt that the Labor government will suddenly decide to start putting tariffs on tropical fruit juices again. We've also got to negotiate our own trade deals, and you've probably heard a lot about that. We rolled over all of the ones we have with the EU. We got a completely tariff-free and quota-free trade deal with the EU. We've done new deals with Australia, New Zealand and the CPTPP, also with Ukraine and the Eastern and Southern African countries. We've improved our agreement with Japan. We have a digital trade agreement with Singapore. We've created our own developing countries trading schemes, and we're still negotiating with South Korea, Switzerland, India, Israel, Canada, Mexico, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So all of this stuff is happening, and we haven't had to do crazy things like the EU is about to put very high tariffs onto Chinese electric vehicles, even though they're also mandating that their population drive electric vehicles. And this tariff will not only affect the Chinese vehicles, but it'll also affect Minis and Volkswagens and Teslas, which are being made in China. So I could go on. We've got control of our borders. You probably know about that. We've got control of our waters. We can now close down the Dogger Bank and protect seabirds and sand eels from trawling. We can do all sorts of things that we couldn't do before. And the idea that the EU, that the Labour Party would want to go back and let the EU control of all of those things just appears to be madness because, these are things that members of the left and, the people in Lowestoft and Grimsby have wanted for years, and we finally got them. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. So the kind of main point I want to make in my remarks is to put forward the argument that the idea of global Britain, which we heard a lot about following the referendum and which was kind of the intellectual guiding star for UK trade policy over the last 8 years or so, that this idea has failed, and that we're now at a point where we can conclude that kind of global Britain has failed as a trade strategy, and that therefore it is time to rethink what the UK's trade strategy should look like going forward, and that some form of reset of relations with the EU should be part of that discussion. And then we can get into a lot more detail about exactly what an EU reset, where it could potentially be beneficial. Okay, so why do I say global Britain has failed? Right. Let's start by reminding ourselves what the idea of global Britain was. It was the idea that outside the EU, the UK would be able to kind of reorient its trade towards the rest of the world, and that this would unleash British trade to kind of become a global trading superpower. We've now got kind of 8 years, 4 years since Brexit, 8 years since the referendum, to see kind of how that's worked. And it just hasn't worked, okay? And it hasn't worked along a number of different dimensions. Firstly, we haven't succeeded in getting new trade agreements with any of the big players in the global economy. We haven't got a deal with the US. We haven't got a deal with China. Talks are ongoing with India, but they haven't concluded a deal there so far. Okay, so we haven't kind of succeeded in kind of luring one of the big fish in that sense. We have negotiated, as Catherine kind of rightly just mentioned, there have been new deals with Australia and New Zealand, and we've joined the Pacific Trade Agreement. And these are all welcome in their own right, but they're also teeny. The government's own analysis produced under the last government suggests each of those deals is worth less than 0.1% of GDP in terms of economic benefit. So, great, but frankly, kind of trivial in the big scheme of things. And then the third thing is, if you look at the performance of UK trade since the referendum and since Brexit, it hasn't been great. There hasn't been this surge in trade. When you adjust goods trade for inflation, our goods trade adjusted for inflation is lower last year than it was in 2016. We just haven't seen that big growth. And now, I think there are a lot of factors behind that, and Brexit probably isn't the main one. But if we thought that there was going to be this kind of rapid growth in trade with the rest of the world, it simply hasn't happened. Okay? So why has global Britain failed as an idea? Kind of why didn't it work out? I think there are 2 reasons, which I'd summarize as 1, geography, and 2, timing. Okay? So geography. The closest thing there is to kind of a law of economics is that you trade more with countries that are closer to you and that are really big. Right? This is what economists refer to as gravity models of trade, and they're really important. And the EU is a big market, very close to the UK, so the EU is always going to be the UK's biggest trading partner. That doesn't necessarily mean we should only prioritize trade relations with the EU, but any trade strategy that tries to kind of simply ignore our trade relations with the EU is, I think, kind of doomed to failure. So that's the geography part. But then there's also the timing part. Right? And this was more just bad luck. Right? The last decade has really been the first decade since the Second World War where the global trading system has kind of shut down rather than opened up. If Brexit had happened in the 1990s and we'd gone to the US and asked for a trade deal, I think we'd have got one, and it could have been quite ambitious. But the US isn't in a mood to do trade deals now, right? And that's reflected in a kind of turn away from free trade in many other countries. So we've been unlucky with the timing and haven't been able to, sort of move forward and get those new trade deals that we may have hoped to. So, if we accept the premise that, global Britain has failed and is not the future of the UK's trade strategy, what can we do? Right? And there's where I think, Starmer, however frustratingly vague he often is, has a point that it is time to kind of re-examine whether there are ways to kind of improve our relations with the EU. But in doing that, we need to be very, honest about what is possible. If we don't want to go back into the single market and the customs union, or even to rejoin the EU, right? And I think there's clearly not a majority in the country to do any of those things at this time. There aren't going to be major changes to our trade relationship with the EU. If we want to find major economic benefits, you have to make those kind of major steps towards integrating with the EU. Right? Clearly, we're not going to do that in the near future. So what scope is there for a kind of more minor rearrangement of the relationship, for a more minor EU reset? It's limited, right? There are areas where you could potentially reduce some of the frictions with the EU while remaining outside the customs union and single market. I think there's scope to do better in terms of a veterinary agreement, which would benefit agricultural trade. You can also look at opportunities for, the EU would like a youth mobility scheme. Labour has kind of said it at this time isn't interested in that because it thinks it's too close to freedom of movement. Frankly, I think that's kind of nonsense. There's a clear conceptual difference between freedom of movement, which is anyone can come here and work if they want to, and young people can come here to work or live for a few years and then they have to go back. So there is scope for some steps to improve the relationship. And then final thing I would say is there is also scope to keep trade costs down by not diverging further in cases when it's not in the UK's interest. And here I think I would actually agree with a lot of what Catherine said, which is that outside the EU, we are free to set our own regulations. And there's a trade-off between being able to tailor regulations to the UK's specific needs. And Catherine gave some great examples of where we can potentially do this. But also, the more you diverge from the EU, the harder it is to trade with the EU. So you've got to kind of do that cost-benefit trade-off when you're thinking about designing the UK's regulatory architecture. And I think that should be part of the reset as well. Thank you.
Very well.
Thanks, Phil. Lovely to be here. I didn't vote to leave the EU. So if you did, this screw-up is on you. And it's on you because you were sold a pup, and a really, really poor one as well. I mean, look, those people who say that this was about controlling the border and this was about not letting in people from Europe, but letting in loads of other people from all around the other side of the world, more than doubling the immigration numbers in this country, complete disgrace. Grand Old Duke of York marching people up the hill only to march them down again. Politicians in this country have to be very, very careful with playing around with people's emotions like that. People voted because they wanted the numbers to come down, and they haven't come down. Do I want to go back? No, I don't, because I'm a Democrat. So despite the polling figures, and I'll just read them to you, YouGov last December 23, 52% of Britons believe that leaving the EU was the wrong decision. 57% would support joining the EU single market with free movement. 22% are opposed, and 72% want the UK to have closer ties with the EU. So do I, but I don't want to go back because I'm a Democrat, and there is no mandate to go back at all. Who apart from me realizes this? One Keir Starmer. Now look, once he's got past dealing with the Taylor Swift issues that he's been having over the summer, he will get round to thinking about what he wants with the EU. He's talked about having a reset of the relationship. The mood music has changed, clearly. He's been touring European capitals. He hosted the European Political Community Summit in Blenheim Palace. So the mood music has changed. But there is a very clear reason why the Labour government will not go running back to the arms of the EU. And it's not because they don't want to increase trade and achieve growth, to Thomas's point. It is because of the raw politics of the situation in which they find themselves. Yes, they got a whopping big majority based on 33% of the popular vote. They know that it's wafer thin, and if they have a hint of wanting to go back, those seats on the red wall will be going the other way. And also, there's no point trying to suck up to the Southerners who voted Lib Dem. They've gone. Those 70 seats are gone. They're not coming back. They're with the Lib Dems. We call it yellow peril. Once they're in, they work really hard. They do loads of leaflets. They bore people they bore people's senses with their leafleting, but they stick around, the Lib Dems, right? So forget about it. It's done. So what can be done here? Three things that I think they're going to focus on. The first is around trade. So the point is this, that the trade flows between the EU and the UK are it's the most important trading bloc we have, right? So over 40%, 42% of our exports go there, 52% of our imports come from there. We need to have a better trading arrangement. Now, the trading cooperation agreement is there, but is it going to be a whole-scale rewrite? Are we going to join the single market? Of course we're not, because freedom of movement is not on the table. That is why Starmer, to be fair, is not entertaining this German youth mobility scheme, because he knows it's politically incendiary. It's not going to happen. So what we're going to have is the policy of tinkering around the edges. So far from Europhilia, this is basically a policy of Euro-agnosticism. The Labour Party vaguely wants to improve its relations with Europe, but it's not prepared to die in a ditch over it because it's not politically expedient to do so. So there'll be some tinkering around. There might be some chemicals agreement to avoid being part of the single market. But this is actually going to also upset the EU because they're saying on their side, what do you want? What do you want? You're coming here and making the right noises. What do you actually want from us? This is not Woolworths. This is not the pick and mix approach to being part of Europe. What do you want from us? And we've got to be clear. And so far, they're not even entertaining. Labour's not entertaining the youth mobility scheme, and the EU's not entertaining a thing for touring musicians, which is, up to them. And I'm a DJ, right? It would probably help me if I could go around touring Europe without any issues. No frictionless issues, even though we only go around with a USB stick nowadays when we're DJing, but still. So that's one thing. The first thing is around trade and economics. The second thing is around security and defence. Now, here I'm a bit more hopeful because the EU needs us. And why do they need us? Because there's a war going on the eastern flank of Europe, in case nobody had noticed, in Ukraine, which is not exactly going in a particularly positive direction. The EU understands that we, as one of the two nuclear-armed states of European powers in NATO, are pretty flipping important, right? If the EU wants to sort out its security. And even Macron realizes this particular issue. So I do think there's probably going to be more cooperation around security and foreign affairs in that particular area. There's talk about a UK-German security pact. We'll see what the details of that are. But I do think that in an environment where the US election's only a few days away, we have no idea what's going to happen there. If Trump gets back in, all bets are off in terms of what happens with NATO, although I think his bark is worse than his bite. So I do think we have to be taking more responsibility for our own security in Europe. That is going to be a key thing, and that's a serious thing where the UK can play an important role. Now, I think the third element of this is around culture and environment. So on the environmental part of the policy here, this is a challenge that we all face. And I think that there's going to be potentially some cooperation that can happen there in terms of agreements, the way we go forward. We know that this is also high on the agenda of the new incoming Labour, the new Labour government, talking about greening the economy and everything else. They need to take people with them. We're seeing the problems that Europe has had with the rise of the AfD, partly around decarbonisation policy. But I do think that there are areas of cooperation there. And I also think there are cultural areas of cooperation, although I'm not hopeful with this youth movement scheme because, as I say, Starmer has vetoed it so far because he knows it will absolutely look appalling to actually be introducing freedom of movement. So, in conclusion, what is the Labour vision of Europe going forward? Not much. It's sort of incremental steps because it's too politically difficult and incendiary to do anything more radical. We'll see where they go. The music has changed. The devil will be in the detail, and the hard stuff comes when you're actually trying to negotiate amendments to trade agreements. We shall see where it goes.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. It appears that I'm a pup salesman, so hi there. So that pup which we sold, actually, I disagree with Ali a bit there in the sense that I was absolutely convinced one of the entertaining questions I would regularly ask prior to the referendum was, what's the country going to look like in 10 years' time? You get your referendum, you leave the European Union, what's it going to look like? And my answer was, I haven't a clue. I have no idea whatsoever. And that's deliberate. The whole point was putting the direction of our country back in the hands of our countrymen and women. And they could vote for Corbyn if they so desired, and they could vote for Farage if they so desired, but it would be up to them. It would not be up to some planner in a room in Brussels. And that was the whole point. And the economic argument was important, but it wasn't the point. It really wasn't the point. I seem to recall this, but if you leave the European Union, there will be a reduction in the growth of GDP by 2% over 15 years, and therefore it will be worth 100 billion. It's fantasy figures. We can't make plans for what happens in 2 years' time. The idea of having ideas and settled ideas of what our growth and how our economy would go in 10 to 50 years hence was for the birds, utterly for the birds. But that being said, you talk about the philosophy in global Britain, I would say one of the major problems in the post-2016 position was that we were led by governments that saw Brexit as a disaster to be mitigated rather than an opportunity to be grasped. And you mentioned the fact we don't have a trade deal with the US. In 2016, Trump was elected the most pro-UK president in recent history, if not ever. And yet, European governments and our own government were so terrified of toxic Trump, we did not take advantage of that opportunity to build that free trade agreement while the sun shone. And then we have American governments that are not in favour of this country particularly, and we lost that golden opportunity, and that was entirely our fault. And so I think it is a significant problem. Now, yes, the Pacific Trade Agreement, the ANZUS Trade Agreement, and things of this sort, these are drops in the right direction, but they're not massive. However, the great European economic landmass is a reducing landmass. Its share of global trade is reducing significantly over a period of time, and I do not see that corner being turned. It is not going to be the economic tiger of future years. It just isn't. And so should we be focusing all our trading campaign and the way we're looking at future trade deals on a diminishing market? It's a big one. It's an important one. It has that gravity you mentioned. Absolutely. But should that be our focus? Well, no, we do have to look globally, whether we be very good at it or not. There I agree. We haven't been good at it. We could do better. We could do much better. And I think the India deal is on its way. It's pretty damn close now. Doing a major trading deal with China? Right now, geopolitics aside, no, you can't have geopolitics aside. Do I really want to have a major trading deal with China when China's major interest is to ensure that the West loses? I don't think we have a political class that has the backbone to do a trading deal with a country like China that has no interest in playing anything other than hardball. So I think I wouldn't say we stay out of the market when it comes to China, but we have to be very careful where long spoons time with the Chinese market and the Chinese governance and how they do trade deals. But I mean, one thing which I thought was very interesting, a couple of days ago, the Süddeutsche Zeitung wrote an interesting comment about how Britain is approaching its new relations with the European Union, the coming back to the EU as our debate is titled. Oh, the question they asked is, what apart from nice pictures with important people in Brussels and a better tone does Keir Starmer really want from the EU? And actually, David Lammy going to the Foreign Affairs Council this week, that event you were talking about in Blenheim, it's icing, isn't it? It's not actually cake. And it doesn't seem to me to have anything substantial. They're talking about defence agreements. Well, when it comes to procurement, when it comes to defence, and Trump, as you said, his bike is working his bark, and when it comes to, bark is working his bite, when it comes to NATO, Trump was only making those points because he wanted the European Union countries to actually pay their ruddy way. Right now, Germany has improved since the Ukraine. But by and large, there are precious few countries in Europe that are part of NATO who actually pay their way. And his threat isn't, I'm not going to defend you. It's, I want you to pay. And that's only fair, because America's been paying for our defence and the European defence since the war, while we'll be building up a welfare state to weaken ourselves. And I'm sorry, America doesn't feel that way anymore. So, are we going back to the EU, as the question asked? Yeah, tone, yes, they want to have nice trips, they want to, ideally, Ali will be able to go around Europe and bash his decks, but I don't think it is advise it. I don't think it's going to happen. And I don't think the European Union is interesting in that which we have to offer in a practical sense. What can we offer? A few battalions. Well, actually, our armed force is such a mess at present. I'm not sure those battalions are any good. But other than that, they see a market, and they see a team, a negotiating team, that's probably worse than the one that went out before. So they think an opportunity is there. But beyond that, I can't see it. Thank you.